Yes. We're going live now. Good morning, Geshe. Good morning, Katrina, and welcome to everyone online. This morning, Geshe Thabkhe is going to be teaching from the great treatise on the stages of the path of enlightenment, volume 3 of the English translation, starting on page 290. And we have included a link for you in the chat box if you don't have that text. And also the prayers and recitations are found in the chat box too. So we'll begin with our recitations.
The teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one God to bliss, knower of the world, supreme God of beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans to you, the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I'm supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, supreme God, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like the spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, fallen sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offer to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowy clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the merit I create by listening to the Dharma. I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the merit I create by listening to the Dharma. I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, by the merit I create by listening to the Dharma. I will will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
This side of it. Oh yeah, oh yeah. But you got to see what something. What it had to say, sir. Punjo Kelly, to be good, tired, the walk on a soon. Malusia just is in sick, but to suggest all the locals are. Oh yeah. That's all. But you seem to come jiggy. Cindy Pamet Chamberwa. Any Jawa Nashi Jawa Manamso. Padam Madam Yen Dula Soba Majura Maybe. Tamjirala and it in Shimbujani. And it did have a train so a shadow. And the cars over there. Jawatani. Tarvada Tamji Chimbe Komalam Gubach. Chinubach Jaku. The shadow. And it are Jawan Dennis on the Jawan Siramambo. Gava Mambolia. They send you to the Chimba children server someday. Sirola Sobala Sunday. Janku and they couldn't just send you the command of Bushes Chinese at top of the Shah. They said, oh, and it ambitious sending in Yambe. Gulun Sanjuku Sim. Mata Chumas and they said on the December shows. Oh, yeah.
So first, we should think that all mother sentient beings, like our mother and father in this life, there is no being that hasn't acted as our mother, our father, our friend, our relative. And because of that great kindness that they have shown us in all of our previous lives, in order to repay their kindness, we generate this desire to be able to lead them to liberation in the state of omniscience, not just immediately, but by practicing lifetime after lifetime, practicing these various practices such as generosity and ethics, patience, joyous effort, meditative concentration, and wisdom, in order to be able to attain the state of Buddhahood, wherein one has eliminated all faults and developed all good qualities. So like that, we should set a motivation of bodhicitta, set our mind in this way for listening to these teachings.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, take the car soda. That's simply Tamji to Andrew Bechido. Sanjay Kova Tober Cha, some do. Yeah, Kashi did some good. Oh, Shema Sanjay Kova Tomlin, some gentle Shemado. Thunder, some gentle Shemaris. Sanjay Kova Tom Sasson, Sanjay, some gentle to the Mardo. Jawan Dines on the Jawan Jawa, Serenity, Tuesday. Jenny Chambata Nizi Chanju Sim. And I Chimba, Sutim Saba, someday Sira Plasoba, Paro de Chimba Truk and Yamila Chane. Only Jawana Jamambo, Tabda Siram Nelia, Combachene. And it Tartugwe, Tapsin Yaga Tartugwe, Sanjay Kovan, Tobachagis, you are no. It's like Jawana Sirap Tamjeto, Shangy Turtu, Chambata Sirap, Tabda Siram Yaga, Sambo Konda Kondo Piggy. And in the way you also saw back on there. Subject to get a Sanjay Kovan, but the Tobachigis is some your door. Mato Sanjay Kovan talks on any church you can Tandaka Simbe to message so that it is some your mardo. Yeah.
So some people might think that, well, when I attain that state of Buddhahood, then I'll be able to work for the benefit, for the welfare of all sentient beings. When I get to that kind of state, then I will be able to really benefit them. But this is kind of a mistaken attitude, because we are going to, through lifetime after lifetime, work for the benefit of other sentient beings. Although Buddhahood represents the culmination, the perfection, the completion of that ability to be able to benefit or work for the welfare of others in lifetime after lifetime by developing love and compassion and bodhicitta, the practices of the six perfections like generosity and ethics and patience, wisdom, and so forth, then we will be able to actually benefit others as we work toward the state of Buddhahood, wherein we have completely sort of developed, fully culminated that ability to benefit others. But we shouldn't have this thought like, well, until that state of Buddhahood, I can't really do anything to benefit others. Rather, in lifetime after lifetime, all of the practices that lead to that culmination are about benefiting other sentient beings.
Oh yeah, they do kasura. Oh yeah, they do. Tandanga to the kasura. Tandanero, Tandane. Shala Chaw Pambata, Shala Pembatube, Samjis Samlu Yongdoa, Sambada, Samlu Tumeta, Chandu, Samlu Tata, Tomdu, Samlu Yongdo. Oh, that Karsura. Shala Chaw Pangi, Simbatsu, Sabala, Sobala, Chungi, that Tambuna Kasha, Tombalan Sangazin, she said about the chicken Sikela, they could have paid to Guardo. The man at Tombalan, ever that today in Tombalan and Yeri Samlutan to Niabudua. Oh, Tirini Matelia, Chawapangni, Shala Chawapangi, some Chimsum, some. And it's Sibala Soba, was Taya Yunada, was Taya Mena, Tonsimilar Soba Pelni, at the chicken samsara. And you all did I say, Sentilia, Mikiwa Chupa, Kiwachu to be. Somebody needs sober combi some toast or some tangichena, paint of Gurado. The man of Kota station, Tomba of Tendekela manner, so much and I saw you pang be paint of Marwa. Kita to Kosoki, Chego, Matas, Tedegora, Kumaku, Mara, Chego Mara. They could take a masara, Madu, Kawake to go Mardo. Sangaran, nearing it in Sangora, Sambugardo. Nanjupene Sanjay Sudan Soy Son Chajuba Dotan Jefferson, Tamdu Simulation Dabayanati, Tirinyamulia, Simjaria, Chawapangi, some. Lunga Yusuf Yukon and Mikiwa Chupa, Kawachu to be some. Oh, Tindisam Guinanti, Pang be pain to Gura. So Chigi Omar, the soldier Pang be pain to Gura, or Tirinyaman, so Chig Mesam, Karina, Shala Chawachig Mesam. Lunga Yusuf Yukon and Shalan Deva Chig Mesam. Anything you would Tipang be paying to Gurua. This some Madame Tashanako, Soche, or Marakumaku, or Marimazimba, or Marde, Kotiba Masare, Madoke to your Marwa. Or do you think you didn't recommend a Samutana? And then you might talk about a Samutana because soon the church do it all. Oh, teachers.
So therefore, from now, from this moment, we should take up this kind of practice of abandoning harming others and working for their welfare, having this attitude where we recognize that all sentient beings desire to have happiness and all want to be free from suffering. So when we have that kind of attitude, we should actually take the time to set a motivation or sort of set an intention in order to really gain the benefit of those virtues of giving up, say, harming others and so forth. So even if we haven't taken some kind of formal vow, if we think like in this day, today, I am not going to harm anyone. I'm not going to cause any sort of hurt to others. And rather, I'm going to hold to some kind of ethical values. And I'm going to, even if I don't actually engage in generosity, try to increase that mind that is generous, that is able to give things away. And so if we set that kind of intention, thinking that, well, today I'm going to engage in these activities to actually bring our mind to really recognize the benefit of giving up harm and not killing and stealing and so forth, then we actually gain the benefits of those virtuous actions. Because otherwise, like just not doing those things doesn't make it a virtue. Like, for example, a dog maybe laying around, and like if it's in your house or something, it's not engaged in killing, it's not engaged in stealing or lying, but that dog isn't reaping the benefits of those abandoning those non-virtuous actions. So we should set our intention in order to gain the benefits that come from those virtues of abandoning the 10 non-virtues. So think, I'm going to work to try to benefit others. I'm going to work to abandon any kind of harm. And thereby the power of our virtue will be enhanced, will be increased.
Oh, this is the because I'm just teaching so change somebody change to the same thing. Right? Keba mambo kale chapter tene sanje ko ban toba chi sam te che do tomba lan che che de. Tene ko nil ko de de na da. Da se so bu de to da cham jan da du na da te je ne ka bla ko sunam bar ma se ba yong gur se do. Ke wa lab chim bu sa do. Kare se ne ko ram me je ko ra de. Ke wa ne ke wa de shen ben tu yen ba shi che do ko ning ta ba ne tan sa do. Te de ko so we ne ka bi ne kala se we ka bi na da. The current negative Nikuba negative Lusoy negative Tabshira, or to do some cookie or the other door. Tinashi called Thomas Sonja teaching, does carry on Timani needed soon Sunday in a Tomagan needing some Tango, Timani pay to Mare. Arazo needing some Tambeneco, the church or oh, yeah, teachers on the door.
So as we have discussed earlier, bodhisattvas are working to attain Buddhahood, and will go eons and eons with that kind of goal in mind, working for the benefit of others and finally attaining that state of Buddhahood. And because they have made that kind of vow, that pledge, even when they are, say, sleeping or not aware or just walking around, they are increasing their virtue. Whatever they are doing is virtuous because they have made that kind of vow from the depths of their heart and are really sincere in their commitment to that, such that every action that they engage in is infused with that kind of intention. And so if we have not, say, taken a formal vow, we should try to think of this every day, to really think of and set that intention that we are abandoning those non-virtues in order to really gain the benefit of that.
Oh, yeah, because it's inside the so Shinaji Migbatelia, Sum de Sonsoa, oh, Sanjay Sonab Tamje, and it Tekonanila, Chobata, Tekonanila, Chibata, Tekonanila, Babam, Ya Tekonani Mosutembe, is Tanda Sumnala to doing the Migres Chiche. And a Pumbuda come the Kichil Mibas Chiche. Then Sanjay Kula Mibas, Mibas Sum Sheswa, all Tichisona.
So last time, in terms of what we had gone over, we had looked at these 3 objects of serenity meditation. Again, the first being that all of the teachings of the Buddha, or the 12 sets of scriptures and so forth, can be summarized as all leading to suchness, that they will lead to suchness, and that they have led to suchness, so that they are all either directly teaching ultimate reality or indirectly leading toward that. And then secondly was meditating on the aggregates and the various constituents and so forth, the sense bases, powers, objects, and consciousnesses. And then finally, the third object was the body of a Buddha, taking that as one's object.
No, yeah, that thing is a conversation, engaging the lecture, Kobani Yongre Sonsoa, Chiwa de la Kasi, Sumji Sheswa, Chitani Sumji Yongudua. Chiwa Tamota, Chiwa Rakbas, and Yisungdua. Oh, and they got so that. Chiwa Rakba the Carol Seriousna, Mipatilla Mission by Negab Susiorno, Secha, you, Nature, you tell a name, Saburachitos Tunguyanaya, Jenny Shugmana, Secha and Arshidua, Shepherd by Sugas, Kevin Armanase, and Echo did a do daughter, Secha Armana. Nature says Yuja, Sajang Armena, young Adam says shook the Manchur Shibena, and Teliati Chotamo Sedua. Oh, Chotamo Sedua. Dinner? Some Chotamo Chawade. Oh, Dana Shene, Chama Rabasi Yanchi Sherdo. Oh, take Arisha. Oh, then it goes. Oh, the Norway China, Jandasu, Clearne. Oh, the Thomas Christie, some shares it in Alcina, did it. Oh, teacher, talk over the town, ni share doa, ni share suchi and doa. Oh, take a soda. Some make well a nation began a sort of chilo, but since on the Shenja one day, patches no cover Aguasera. Not to understand your cookum guare. Yash and there is some Legacia, Nangalegada, Pandusun, Chala, Carina, then there's some dance on the cook over Aguadova. Yeah. Talk over Thomas Chisha. Cover Thomas said the social make better Sanja Kuris Kumguna Telecom Comguare. Yene, some have several of Chesha. Warness and Azunga Pechagua. Chagba. Kunga Chudra Chagba Jagra. Kanaba Chagba kept a mission and Rosa today. In a warning, I shouldn't drog. Kane Chagba rate a wholly a clear shouldn't drog. Or Tinashi. Sim Migbalia Sanja Kudas Minite or the inner Sim Gasurjan and that's tendo. Nimelagacia to the pa some lokudo kudo or no. Oh, Tiliani Chama Tamusegua. Chama Tamus did. Oh, the Chicum come there, the Surgeon, some Lishandas in the Drochigora. Teach Chama Tamusegua, and I'm saying to teach you. Oh, Tatundako, get into the Chimata, Govanidua. Chima said the same. Mamjadi shook my gibbs, shook my gibbs, her tana. She seemed to some day her tana, and it's Chima do. Goba said the Mikba till Samluta till Madame Shandal and Duro Cheba Shandal Sinsona, no Goba said, Chimada Goba in the city with her teachers on them. Shandos Hasida.
So, and last time we had discussed that the two main sort of obstacles to developing meditative stabilization are these two of dullness and excitement. So there can be sort of various levels of these in terms of dullness and excitement. We had gone through, there can be like a coarse, a more sort of middling and subtle, although usually we see them divided into coarse and subtle. So here, when we have a dullness, the sort of subtle form of dullness is where although we have the kind of clarity, the aspect of clarity, and there is stability to that mind, so we're abiding on the particular object and there is some degree of clarity, if one's lacking the sort of strength or vividness of that object, then this is a sign that one has this kind of subtle type of dullness. And so here we had sort of gone through where it was describing how these arise when the mind is not very clearly on the object. Now, a more coarse form of this kind of dullness would be when one loses that clarity all together. It's sort of like becomes completely dark or like you're falling asleep or something like that. And on the other hand, we can have the sort of issue of excitement, where out of attachment, the mind gets distracted away from the object, thinking about the various things that we need to do or what we are desiring, or sort of all kinds of different objects that we can be drawn away from our main object of meditation. So when this is a really coarse form, we may lose the object altogether. We sort of are like pulled away and distracted entirely from our object. But there's a more subtle sort of form of excitement where you may be holding on to the object, but sort of part of the mind is drifting or getting distracted away. Like when you have in the winter, the top of a lake or a river may freeze over, but underneath the water is still sort of flowing. So we can have a situation where our mind, we are able to sort of be on the object, but we're partly getting pulled away to the things that we need to do, or what I want to buy, or what it is that I am going to plan on for next week, or whatever it may be. We need to immediately be able to recognize that and bring the mind back to the object. So dullness comes when we are too loose, when we're lacking this sort of strength of holding the object, whereas excitement is really getting pulled away from the object. You lose the sort of stability because of being distracted away out of attachment and desire.
Oh, yeah, don't do matter. Oh, Tini Andy Kasoda. No, Pechana Songo Dua. the Pechani Sungdua. The Cemetery, Timinga Soda, said to the Damage La Circus Road. Circus Nalia teaching Dua. Lambuchi to the Bay, Caraches and Cheja Beko, which had Yala to Kangachidua. Oh, the Lambuchi to the Ya, Tambu Chambuche Labdus and Segdua. And it got in the Tapa Chata in the Yavutam. And it checked you in the check, Tada Jigmandonity Shudua. She checked you Segdua. Oh, didn't she Tagbepa, Migbe del Tagbepa Tamguara. Did Tambadi Pa, Migbe Comje del Pa, Sembi Langbudi, so Sem de Lange da Pechaswa, Sembi Langbus, Lange Matu and Kaskal and Roshara. Takulanji tu ne Sarges na Lega Yabuche, Kokalian Buchigdoa, Tinashing and Josem de Kanjuma Jumandoje, so some Tansit and Atagata town, which is Oguyara. Sembi Lambu Matuade, Migbe Kawa. Kawachi de Migba Karakumgina, Sanjay Kukumgina, Ujungo Kumgina Karintira, or Teliane, Tembe Tagbe, Paching, Tembe de Tiran Pasha, Kumjedra Pasha, Chudra. No, any Teletagda, Degdo Padu on the Yatsuku, Madu on the art or Sancto Chokudwa, T. Shishin Digidwa, Padu, Epamadosia, Shishin Digitari. Lambuchelia chak di shubene susho suku mibal shadwa ya ma nyom don ma dugdon ya to ya to susho se ya te gan shadwa o ti pechan sungdwa simple lambu ya da wasera o di shi mibbe ka wa tembutelia tembe takbechi ani shi gi chak ju sa gore sta tende chen su komgoro don tambune ko chime chi shin ngu ma to Yan Pandu to come out to go then they said, any year down Lord of the Comsona, and the Paruchili Abuchagota. Sim Chidan Devanashi, Rawans in the Paju Tomge, El Tambus Semsin top, Semlia, Gange Melche, Tawachepe, Kajakomna, Dinging Ronya, Sejiko, the Hell Katsurmato, Galakana to the Ungumardo. El Lucian Jase. Oh, then she young to West Becone, Rangi Mipala Rawadu Junicora, Samlutan de Tada, then Chimanda, Quebec, and that train, Tended Tanging Simji Topsona, and she knew when they talk about yeah.
So then to give an example to illustrate this, this is sort of like when we have an elephant that has not been tamed. This is likened to our mind when we initially begin to try to practice this. So like a kind of untamed wild elephant, one needs to sort of subdue that through a process of first like having a rope and tying it to a pole of some kind. To be able to hold it there. And when you're trying to train this elephant to do what you want to do, you are sort of going to correct it or punish it with this metal hook when it doesn't do what you want it to do. And so this is how our mind is. When we place it on an object of meditation, it's kind of like we're tying this rope, like this wild, tying this elephant to a post in order to keep it fixed on something. And when our mind gets distracted away, gets pulled away to other things, then we need to use introspection, which is like this sort of hook-like tool that one uses to hit this elephant in order to get it to do what you want. And so this is something where we aren't initially able to keep our minds focused on a single object, but we need to develop the ability through bringing our mind back again and again. We try to tie it to that object with the rope of mindfulness and use introspection to recognize when we have strayed. And so over time, with practice, we're able to keep our mind single-pointedly focused for a longer and longer amount of time until we attain the kind of blissful pliancy of body and mind, such that we're able to remain single-pointedly focused without any sort of difficulty, either mental or physical difficulty. And when we're sort of held, our meditation is infused or held with that bliss of mental and physical pliancy, agency, then we have sort of control over our minds, the ability to place it for as long as we want without any kind of difficulty on a particular object.
Oh yeah. I should not talk to any how don't combat tabas. She need to be chase or any shirabi, the conaniel jebasing and how don't combat the tegres, ribaration good. Caresana, loud dig it. She need to make well chase to never some roa. Make well chase to never take some yeko, Yamopan to Mare, some Yamoka tabat to Mare. She's a nature change my loba carrying, but the taxation is so shit to Mardo, Toto Guamardo. I think it is a co Sanjay Surab Kanga de Chida, the Conanilia, Tribe, Tab, the Conani, most of them bomb, most of them and a Gubecone, the Conani talk with Tabs and Roa Shachi in Sogodoa. The end of the course of Chebaseja, she's a nature, Nyamogi Nemo Dronganke, Nyamo Tatumge, Mishibe Mobo Setumge, she's a nature to much Shengenge, or how to the Keko or no. What do you do? Till you had it. She's a nature Chebaseja, Toyati, how long we say Togumado, she next Togumares. Some case on Mado, does ne Debachiki, Yichi Mado. To Mato, to said the candidate mother Hako Cheneni, never Cheku Orto. Oh, dear Lucasura. How don't combat the tegres? Teconani Chebachibel, how don't the Magina, Yamota to Mare. Tarba Tobichedu, how don't come good, not under Tarba Tobala, Koetzawa, Tanzila Soba, Tezo Mebasogu. Koetzawa the Mebasovala, Koetzawa the Tayuban Zimbanashi. And the mebati shake yodo. Time by shebala taxation at you don't carry you in a carico or a man can do you don't look at it, request shebashe, take on in shake yodo. Oh, this one's oh, how don't combat the tabaris, she need tangbagi, and then Yamotaba say to Mare, Mishibe Mobasa or say to Mares, Tenil how don't come with this. Oh, Tenil how don't come to Takarice over the Conani, she said. One at the Karina teacher is or Tibetan Doswa. Yeah.
So then following gaining serenity, it is logical, it is right for us to then engage in the practice of insight. And so insight is developed, as it explains here, that we are investigating the sort of nature of all knowable phenomena. So this is recognizing the sort of special insight is something that is developed through investigation and analysis. So as it says here that mere serenity meditation cannot purify pristine awareness, nor can it eliminate the darkness of obscurations. So here it is only through investigating with insight. This kind of serenity alone is not able to, although we have the ability to remain single-pointedly focused on a particular object, if one doesn't give rise to insight, one is unable to get at, to remove this root of cyclic existence. Recognizing that the root of cyclic existence is this grasping at a self, one comes to understand that the only way to eliminate that is by realizing its opposite, by coming to understand the lack of such a self. So we engage in this by looking at, well, if such a self were to exist, what would be the fault? If it doesn't exist, what would be the reality there? So serenity alone is unable to give us this kind of ability to get at the root of cyclic existence. And so only with wisdom can we realize suchness and therefore effectively eradicate our obscurations and the root of samsara.
Oh, yeah. Tanga du dele soa. Te kona ni chita bu shena sister le soa. Noa. Shine zambine chobar zimba meja o nyam do samos. Ta ona te kona ni chita bu shena sagdong ge te kona ni to ku yena. Ane te kona ni de kande jere sena se. Ane kanga to tambar ngobo tamje kansa da cheje ta kansa da cheje ta ni ji 동바 니 데세 어떤 담발이야 나네 뭐 탐제 로아 술라 소버 풍붕알라 소버 뭐 탐제 Geshe Chungi da Tende Kasura, Geshe Chungi da Kamjoja Soba Chu Tamje, and Kansa da Chuji Damire Sungdua, Kansa da Chuji Dani Tongbani days. Then I should have the Parudu Chimbe Togbar Dudies, Kansa da Chuji Dame Bade, and it Tonga de Simchido, Kansa Damire, some Tagas in Yabashaniko, Togmaton, one and never near Togmaton. alle tambu cheba cheche, rigbe cheba cheche, so shemba chegu yordo. O te duka sore. Te shirib je paru du chimbe tokbar gyurgi ese, shengi ni mainde ese, shen sem cheche du neba chamji, meba cheba chamji, totu mare sungu yordo. Shirib je paru du chimbe tokbar gyurgi ese, shirib je paru du chimba se, chida shirib tar chimba dala shirib je paru du chimba chegu yordo. Sebe paru du chimba, chimbe paru du chimba, chunduji paru chimba tu sigdwa. The paru du chimba is tar chimba dela. Itene yari yaji se ta tele lagwa drake yomar ta tar chimba is shireji paru du chimba ngonedra. Ta tanda shireji paru du chimbe chedu tanda ne shirevle cha, chimbe paru du chimba chawe chedu tanda ne chanju sembe chimba le cha, seba le cha chiwarno. Te paru du chinji du sonja, gyu sonja. Debi mingde kyule tani shegi warno. Ngone paru du chin sarade marade paru du chimbe tabla duguja. Chanchu sembe tuji chimba tsuri sobala soba tuzula ya. Paru du chimbe nyamle, chimbe paru du chimbe nyamle. Soba paru du chimbe nyamle sigdwa. Tigan titanda paru du chin sange di mare. Paru du chimbar chebe, paru du chimbar chenge di shirab gi takji sheni shegu warno. Ozadi shirab gi paru du chimbe, shirab du zuwe. She took good mado, never cheba some she took mare, Sunguarno. Yeah. Shangin in my Indies, Shirab de Paru do Chimbe Tobardi, Shirab de Paru do Chimbe Yamlingi, Yula Taxas again, Shirab to the Tokman Duries or da. Shangin in my Indies, and then Baba Cheba some chichi to never some ye, and it took mare, Sungura. Shangin in my Indi, Power Combang never draw a less. Kongde ji long tang dwa do de kongde chumden de chanju sembe chue namje ngoni ma chi ba ni se chumden de chanju semba namje se chue namje ton da ba ngoni ma chi ba ni se go do ma chi ba ni paru du chimba kang zimba la se chimba chude soba samde shira chudu la soba kare ene shira je tongba ni de kona ni de she to gre se ya kan di shu do Parudu chimba kangi zimba la ase. Jerese wanju shiraji parudu chimba shiraji parudu chimben zindos. Odi shirabji togres. Shiraji parudu chinji ki nyamle shirabdu zog togre mado. Shenda ane tika sure semtichi du nebala sogwa, sebala sogwa. Rwa ane zog totuk ma resungwara. Parudu chimben zindu shi chige Sungpa tabu ose. Tewe na shine la ne de shirab komba cho. Tuzen te sonza shine top sa sona. Ta nelu tadu tokbe chedo shirab de komgu yore ese. Nelu tokbe shirab. Nelu le cheba chene. Tomba ni de komgu yore. Tomba ni tokbe shirab jule kene. Ene shirab ji paru du chimbe. Chin top gres te sungda. Oh yeah.
So, here, then picking up from where we had left off in the text, it says then, what is suchness like? It is the nature of all phenomena that ultimately they are empty of the self of the person and the self of phenomena. So ultimately, all things from the various things that we have talked about, form and so forth, the 12, the sense powers and their objects, as well as the 18 constituents, including those consciousnesses, the person and all phenomena are such that they are empty of having such a self, some kind of an inherent self. And so this is selflessness. This is an understanding that we can only gain through investigation and analysis. We can't sort of gain certainty through just placing our mind single-pointedly on that object, or sort of like saying that to ourselves and then remaining single-pointedly pointedly focused on that, but rather we need to engage in analysis, particularly this development of our wisdom, which is, as it says here, so emptiness, this kind of ultimate nature of phenomena, is realized through the perfection of wisdom and not otherwise. It's only through the perfection of wisdom that this is able to be understood. So here, when we use this word perfection, this is really referring to the completed practice of these various, the various 6 or 10, something where it cannot be increased or developed anymore. There's nothing superior to that. It's the perfection, the sort of culmination of that practice. Now, when we are training in these, we use that name perfection, although they have not yet developed fully to being a perfection. And this is a case of giving the name of the result to the cause. It's something that's quite common. So bodhisattvas, we would say, engage in the practice of the various perfections. They engage in generosity and ethics and patience and joyous effort and meditative concentration and wisdom, but they have not yet perfected them. That will come when they get to the culmination. But this perfection of wisdom, which realizes the ultimate nature of phenomena, isn't something that we can know sort of through wishing to know it, or through imagining it, or through being really stably focused on it alone, but rather, as the quotation here from Unraveling the True Intention Arya Sutra reads, O Tathagata, by which perfection do bodhisattvas apprehend the identitylessness of phenomena? And the Buddha replies, Avalokiteshvara, it is apprehended by the perfection of wisdom. So here, in order to be able to understand ultimate reality, one can't do this through any other means, but rather it is the perfection of wisdom, this investigation into the ultimate nature of reality, or rather the wisdom realizing emptiness, that allows bodhisattvas to apprehend the identitylessness of phenomena or recognize ultimate reality. K kogimindoa. Oh yeah, this one. Tanda this one.
그것도 왜?
Tanda kogido ko.
야야. 단지 데코나니 콤바들이야 니 셰그도아. 간사가 다음에 콤바들 쳬기 다음에 콤바시다. 간사가 다음에 콤바들 셰그도아. 텔라 네제벤 디터 넘버 쳬버샤데스. 디데 딱제체네 간사가 다음에 디토그레스 데코나니 토그레스도. 간사니 봉보다 간사니 봉보다 감다 계절에 그나 미미소세 간사니 봉보라 소병오 니자마인데 봉보라 소바 대단히 미다바다 도메다니 제인 베치다 간사니 딱바다 지빙오 엠버션다게 딱베치로스 오 단지네마 간사가 다음에 디셰도아 어디 데라 데다 넘버 제바체데 간사네 풍부다 감다 제제서 풍부가 외바 간사데 풍부가다 감접게다 계시 중이라 소바 대줄에 현도 외바 말에서 다 소소 풍부도 제나다 속이 풍부 소에 풍부 주시고 넘버 시 풍부 주어다 에 다른 시코 계시 중이시나 수그 계지 대계지 대계지 이렇게 미기 계지 나외 계지 내기 제계지 류기 계지 이기 계지 대줄에 로스요 말도 최기 계지 드마체 대줄 계지 뭐 간사 소수 유기 되베 계시 연구로 미기 계지 나외 계지 내기 제계지 사라 아니 류기 되베 수그 계지 대계지 대계지 이렇게 사라 다음에 감래 미기 감나게 감내 감지 감 얘기 넘버스에 감 미기 넘버스에 감 간사게 규기 되베 풍부가 여도 어때주시고도 어때선자 간사네스 들라 근데 간사네 풍부다스 라게 규례에 풍부하다 라게 규례에 끼치 중일에 끼치 남다 아니 감 남래 로스요 말에서 그나메도 스틸레 샌도요 말에서 소부 파샤, 셈 파샤, 소라 파샤, 두시 파샤, 돈다 류다 셈, 류다 셰바니, 두두두베 류지오라, 류들레 땡땡게 셰바지오라, 딜레 로스야 간사시 로가 숨바지, sobuchi semdi logadua. Ya kansa sumche pe konzu logandaba. Yani su soro dushi number shibe pumbunga yora. Tezule loga chi loso. Kansa di loso yomaris ngombu sebu nashi. Nga di pasha ne taji yone chiriba sa nashi. Ta pumbu nali shu tangere pumbule tenshen beta asu yora. Di yomaru nangbelulia. Pumbu ngale tenshen beta yomaru sungbe. Oti pumbule shendo yomaris. ene pumbu kora zuna ne ta yimba shoro sine te yo ma re sungora kansa ne pumbu da kam da keche le kuina me mi so lo so yo ma re sera ene shendu yo ma re kansa ne pumbu la so be ngo ni ja ma ene so bo de kansa de be pumbu sugi pumbu kansa de be namba shi be pumbu kansa de be yo so de kansa de be dushi de kansa de be 네 두치기 pombo konto da nga je da tozu kansa de besna o tozu de ne kansa mare sungara di chos ngoni jama inde pombo la soba da ne medaba da tume ngoni bese kansa de ta de chiruba la yang kyo tam be won tu chene de go no chiruba chiran du sambaine kansa de ane chikbu danyi raba, takba raba, takba yinsigo dozo, takba chachi menge, koran chikbu, roba chiye megonga, koran janja yotungo, takba chikbu, ane rangja tuba, tende chi rawantu tuba, tende kelingi ordo, tende mares, pumbu di mida mares, takba mares, chatuma yonge chires, chameba mares, di chiru bari kyo tambe wantu chen sungudwa. ngōngi bechida kansa ni takpa da chibi ngōngi yimbara shendaji takpe chiru se kansa de takpa de sikdwa chikbu de se chameji chikbu de pungbu de tinte marwa midak barwa sobo de midak barwa semdi midak barwa chikbu marwa chamangbu yora ko sobo de chamangbu dune pungbu rwa chamangbu pungde yora pungbu re keshe sidu sugi kichi number shiba kishi chebe ko imbena kishi sigdwa suji tong taji tu tiro rejal soboda kishi sigdwa ani megi kichi na kichi tezu karesna teletene suji tong ani suji be number shiba ki ani de yabu do bade se namdo mabu shiba mabu kigra ke che de ngazo nala meche sigdwa merje basun ota meche do se kaskal tile se de ker de kishi sigora pumbu kishi kamsina ko rigira chitoda rigmedawa sula rigmedawa su kam te kamsar ani wangbula rigmedawa miki kamna kamsar atde tara ya mani de pumbu so ni midaba da tume ngoni bechuru kansane takba da chibi ngoni ba shenda ji takbe chiru sa shenda chiru ba takba da ene chachigu menge chamichi ge ngoni sigdo ase soboda sem dozo tinde maro ase medabare yurandu do ase ene chamambu do ase hotire tibado chilana yeah.
So then it says, therefore, meditate on wisdom while engaging in serenity. So here, there are two sorts of major topics or divisions of meditating on wisdom or selflessness. And so this is the selflessness of the person and the selflessness of phenomena. And here, beginning with the selflessness of the person, it says, yogis should analyze in the following manner. A person is not observed as separate from the mental and physical aggregates, the elements and sense powers. So here, if we take this idea of a person and the self of the person, aside from the five aggregates, if we were to sort of set those aside, there's nothing that is separate apart from that we could identify as being the self. Like if we put if we set aside the form aggregate and consciousness and discrimination and karmic formations and feelings and so forth. There's nothing that we could point to as being the self. So if we take like not just the five aggregates, but the various our sense bases, the sense powers, and then the various objects of those, as well as there's consciousness. There's like we can take all of those various things. And here, when we're referring to the kind of elements and sense powers and so forth, those are those that are included within the continuum of a single being. Like so, our own sort of physical form and sounds and smells and tastes and so forth, not sort of general. But if we try to set aside all of those things that constitute what we like the aggregates of the person, then there's nothing that we can find apart from that and say, well, this is the self or this is the person. So if we, I mean, in the most basic sort of categorization, if we look at the mental and physical constituents, the aggregates of this person, if we try to set those aside and point to something else that is not of those, that is of a different nature, sort of like blue and yellow, there's nothing that we can point to as being the person aside from that. So here, the first sort of point is that a person is not observed as separate from the mental and physical aggregates, the elements, and the sense powers. So it's not something that is apart from, aside from, separate from those, nor is a person of the nature of the aggregates and so forth, because the aggregates and so forth have the entity of being many and impermanent. So it's also not the case that the person can be identical with the aggregates or the various sort of sense powers and bases and so forth, because if we then come up with the question, well, is the form the person? Is the consciousness the person? Are the feelings the person? Is distinction, discrimination the person's, or the karmic formations the person? So there are many of them, the aggregates, and they are also in the nature of being impermanent. And so if we assert that they are the self, then the self would have to disintegrate, as do the aggregates. So here, others, so this is referring primarily to non-Buddhists, have imputed the person as being permanent and singular, as if there is some kind of like permanent, singular, solitary sort of person that has autonomy. And this means that they are not sort of contingent or dependent upon any of their parts or any sort of basis, that they are partless. And when we look at, well, the person, we identify the person on the basis of the aggregates, and we can't find something that is partless. The aggregates have various parts, and they are also impermanent. And so therefore there can't be some kind of permanent, singular, autonomous kind of self. Rather, the person is something that is dependent upon these various aggregates, or we could say the sense bases and their various objects and their consciousnesses and so forth. And so the person then, again, there are those non-Buddhists that assert that there is some kind of permanent, singular, autonomous type of self. And we can see that there is no such self, such person that exists like that. And nor does the person exist as somehow separate from the aggregates, nor identical with the aggregates.
Oh yeah. Don't have to do Kasura. Tameda Tongbani, the Kasura. Oh, that Geshe Yeshe Thabkhe. The Donald Social Change Malamera. The Kasura. Curing Bush Temple Dos Donald Gudwa. Any Karasung Dosina. Jambe, Sanju Semba. Jambelia, Sanjay Masone. Sanju Semba Jambelia. Any Tongbani talk by Shirab the Treve, Sanju Semba Chigi. Any Keba Jadon Mongolia, Simba Sudin Saba, some Dela Sobala Cheba Les on Gudwa. Any Tongbani de Terne, Tesum da Chet, Yambam, Roa. Any Tesum Meba Yambani Tevajaroa. Oh, Teniti Rangi Long, the Simless Nalasim, Tisi Cabin du Chair. Any Tishan la Sheva, the Yambala Sobati, any Sonam Cheva in Songudwa. Yeah, teach you Lamna.
Oh. So, this understanding of selflessness or emptiness is something that is said to be extremely important. So, we have from a sutra where the Maitreya is explaining that, or sort of, there's an exchange here in which it is said that bodhisattvas who engage in the first of the five perfections for hundreds of eons, of course, the merit that they would make would be very great. But if someone is to hear the teachings on emptiness, even if they have kind of doubt, a little bit of doubt in their mind, and so even so much more so if they didn't have any kind of doubt, but if they were to hear those teachings on emptiness, hold that in mind and explain that to others, that merit, like of just holding that one verse of teachings on emptiness would be much greater than the bodhisattvas practicing the other perfections for hundreds of eons.
Oh yeah. The nice that was it about us so good on dollar. I did the Kasoda. Some then the future. Tenede Ramjokia future. Some then the Ganga, Chu Ganga Yora. Ganga to Pechama Mambu Yorzo. Ganga Lungi Chema. Ganga Chu Ganga Mando said the Cheme to Kajayana. Tea Tanga Yambe. Draw. Tea Tanga Yambe Chu Ganga. Che. Yan tea Tanga Yambe Tusan and it's a child. Oh, Tende then you come. Tameba Tende last one girl. Rambuchi not doing it. Then you be cable down permits of any Sunday. Nambia Rambuchi not doing it. It's Cheba Shabina. A son of Kandiki days was done. Chu Kanga Trandanyambe Chema, Cheme Trandanyambe Chu Kanga, teach Cheme Trandanyambe, Zambulingi Singam Solas Yoda. A Rambuchi not doing it to be Sangelia Cheba Pune, Geba the permits of Sonam Kazaki days on Gurdon. Oh, the son of Chema Chigurdon. Oh, the Teveja, any Dongbani, the Turbache, Sambache, oh, Tendese, when it is son of Chigres or Teleja, son of Cheres on Guda, oh, Pigilana. Yeah.
Mhm. And also from the Diamond Cutter or the Vajra Cutter Sutra, it is explained that, again, there's this sort of exchange back and forth where it is explained that if a man or a woman were to offer, and here the sort of expansiveness takes on sort of a poetic form of saying that if they were to offer two world systems as numerous as the grains of sand in the Ganges River. So to imagine world systems as numerous as that, like almost countless world systems, and they were to offer to them the seven royal gems, or like the seven royal emblems for countless eons, imagine the kind of merit that they would create from that, of offering to those sort of countless world systems, as many as there are grains of sand in the Ganges. How much merit that would be, almost it would almost be hard to contain. But if someone is to hear a verse on emptiness and hearing that verse on emptiness to reflect upon it, the merit created by that individual would be greater.
Oh, yeah, don't do matter. Oh, yeah, teach you them, yeah, Kamalashila. Oh, that teaching ship when Judge and Dolly Sungda. But I'll do it. Don't Dolly, I say, any Miki was you last talk about Ticket Subsimple Mambusa. Or in this Sangi Kansachi in a Dongbani, maybe 20 years, Tebasha, Sambasati, Koshasona. Oh, Tinity, Lady Triba to Lady Triba, Namima Sungda. That Lady Triba, Langabasa, and a tin, Jebunami Yonko Madese, Kotongbanilia, Tebata Samba Combachana Sungda. Oh, Tination, take some less about sober in that as well, down to 2 years on good. Yeah, this one.
And in another sutra, it explains that even if you have someone who is engaged in very great non-virtuous actions, the 10 non-virtues, or even those 5 negativities of immediate retribution, if a being like that is to listen to teachings on emptiness, such hearing is able to purify even those greatest of stains, those 5 actions that lead to immediate kind of ripening of action. So this is something that is incredibly powerful.
Oh yeah, that tunda 시제바 도진나를 송고도와 태좀 사와 잠비장 시버 휘부 제발 요르 송고도와 다 생게데 여담에 다 가주 삼번나시 라와디 다도 여담에 최탐제 랑원에 주밤 다담바 주바도 여담에 삼 내루 터두 데리아 태좀 사와 잠비자 가데제나 삼고 태좀 사와 잠비자 소다 원래 신제 검제 텐데 전에다 편요요라 태좀 사와 잠비자 시바 휘부 제발 요세 시베 자와데 시베 자와 다 시바 코로 코아디 송거노 코에 코에 배 휘부 십시도 차도고 그래서 야야는 차도게 소리 차고를 송거노 디 가레스나 코아에 다 녀모다 정말 껴가가 용사게 시디 당진다 최기 당진다 간사 당진게 용거라 대대 신유 매바들이야 삼당거라 자와들이야고 예서 탐제긴 중공게 그 자와들이야 하더니 매바서야 그 삼로 코르고요 뒤시지 않고 시버 휘부르죠 코아코라데 희에게 똥에 그거 거라 수도다 타보면 게래 차도요래 가르스는 그 자와데 매바서야 그 거쪽요도 가르주 잘라래 시비ችን 라 꾸마셔 아니 꾸마셔이 마고 꾸망원에 연계될 거 코멘도스는 거 봐줘 미디 다르기로와 다다 나하고 샤삼거도 어디나시 그 자와신게 강가데 당지레도라 다도 나디레 삼로 코라나 시레도 멘도스 딱지시데 아니 스바 코라 녀모다 니 상만 탐제 자와들이야 구조리 스테이어다 어디 늦자고 시바휘버 제발 교수 태좀 사와 잠지자 시바휘버 제발 교수도 다 태좀 매바체 태바체 삼바체 과라 아니 치카도던 시안라 제바다 냠볼로 소바체네 텔레게 펜디심 용거도 알아서 당대 소아시요 말와 사제지된도 컬페면은 다메세 계제코라 용요 말도 다 여바 시샤제 저 토마메바네 여바 코렌지 삼루 여바 코라제 로야레 마도 디 타르바다 미다바다 지제세다 잠바니지 전데 까체부 섭지 까체베 최토야 요마르도 단단 가주치 코아코에 자와디 디레다세 티메반데 소고레스 사제 소네 텔리아 삼루라제 코라테 베니까와 수남 쳔보 누버 쳔보 단다 코티 카두데 토에게 밀테게 요마로 아산제게 송구도 안 도나서 ane kaise nawe mato mege mato ya tenso mede ture doar yurse yabu je ko kewa tu mege wa pa kewa tungete ini hada milche yangne ando kone kondu pe dodes mi toya da nawe toya ke ho mari standard namsa toya ji ho mato nawe mato mengan mato ya tenso mede ture doar tinashi atanda namsa phe tinde do asam jiden le tra tinde che ke ho mari de dinye ka shibu che re sam 다음에 세대 당연히 강가 용사가 자와들이야 다 구조를 접제티 만디브레스 삼로 당겨라 어디인데 pension 부시부시다 텔레테바시에 요번에 선남 첨부시부지 있음 레 마부타기 있음 녀모 마부시에 그 고치고 있음자 개천 부시부지 삼로 코고라 어디 송구도야.
And then, as Aryadeva has stated in his 400 verses, even by just having a little bit of doubt regarding emptiness, we are able to tear samsara to shreds. So here, even if we begin to just have some kind of doubt regarding emptiness, like, well, is there really a self? Is there not a self? This begins our process of totally dismantling or disintegrating samsara. So by having just even that little seed of doubt, this is something that will lead us to the point where we are able to tear samsara to shreds. And so all of our the experience of samsara, all of the afflictions and all of the suffering that we experience, if we think about it and we come to have some kind of understanding that there isn't actually such a self or an apprehended object as we grasp at it, we are beginning then to really get at the root of samsara. We're starting to actually see the root of all of our problems and be able to uproot that. Like say, if we have something stolen from us and initially we have no idea who stole it, but we start to get closer, like we have a little bit of a doubt, I think that person might have done it. We begin then to sort of figure out what has happened here. And so too it is with samsara. Even if we have not yet sort of realized emptiness or selflessness completely, to begin to have that sort of understanding, like, well, maybe this is the source of all of my problems, this grasping at some kind of a self or this apprehension of some kind of a self. And if we begin to even sort of have a doubt, thinking, well, is it this that is the root of all faults? This is something that has an incredible amount of power. So just having that sort of doubt regarding emptiness, let alone hearing the teachings on it, having some kind of understanding and say being able to explain it to others and so forth. And so although we don't live at the time of the actual Buddha, to have this opportunity to hear these teachings on selflessness, to have them in the world at all, is something which is extremely rare and precious, and we should recognize it as such. Here, the Buddha has given these kinds of sort of teachings that we should do virtuous actions and we should abandon non-virtue and so forth. But this isn't something where we're actually able to like see the immediate result. It's not like we can hear or see or perceive it like that. But if we're able to have some basic understanding of this, the sort of what is the root of samsara, recognizing that it's this fundamental kind of misperception, and by recognizing that, we're able to slowly undermine that basis. Although we don't say gain fame or sort of gain a good reputation in the world, if we recognize that this is the basis of all of our transformation, of being able to purify negativities and eventually actualize Buddhahood, then we will really appreciate just how powerful this understanding of emptiness is.
Oh yeah. 풍부디 다다 풍부니 찍마레세 찍마세도 담부데 찍다 타데 마이바디 아버지 신고래 대 아버지 신나니 신다 마부지 아고도거래 다디르바 다 단디급수 우마랑유바데야 우마랑유바다 tenjuala tawe kola mendaarsa sheyo te tusu 먹어셔나죠 다다 tenjuata tusu sobana sheje sheshana tosu 고테기를 맞아야지 투로를 차그리 삼게 어디도 딱게디 풍부 다에는 깨단 직받전도 요르세 게디 풍부 남래신 풍부 천이 매번 요스 싸워시를 겁성고도 게디 풍부 다에는 깨단 직받전도 요르세 게디 풍부 남래신 풍부 천이 매번 요스 다던다 디나 수도 용고도 풍부디 다에 단데서 오라 담보 ngarazo namju samlu khode do ngarazo nga samso samlu khode sa nga de ene ngone chene sobu chera mi lu chiora sobu tele tembe mi choro chiora choro da samlu tanda dushi shagda da tendu da mendra chiora sobu che mendra cha sobu tele tembe ne choro che yu tondu sode te ro de cha tondu choro chiora and dushi chiora samlutanda chiora subu sobo number shebe pombuso namshiti mime paksha da tandachi niba mendara chesdoa pumbunga yora tonda tesu da nyamdo drelne tachi yora mato tesu mene sobu mene mi tachi yungu marwa susu sobu mene susu semde mi semde mene susu mi chene tachi yungu marwa soa didu nyoye mebe 미시 연구 말도. 대소 강가를 뜨진 될네. 아니 nga mi yes sabuche te yora da shigete soboda semda chorodan tushidan dushida tazule tözin delne ene nga mi nga tashi nga tindru yes shagudo mambuzule tözin delne shagudo o tindi aleti silamna mambuzule tözin delne shaguyor mado tazule tözin delme goba Kura dan tamba tuba tsene niye yoban diri shaasi ko tinan tsene dimari tan diri shaasi si raya si korwa dan tamba tubne tindri si tubku yore tsene pa taktun tsene niye yoban si kubu yore o tindri si yomare ali tambu tislamna ya
So here, then, as we get into understanding this explanation of emptiness, now here, when we get into the sort of meditation on selflessness or emptiness, there are distinctions that arise due to the various kind of philosophical schools, like the Prasangika and the Svatantrika, but we'll just go with the sort of Prasangika explanation to be able to sort of have a little bit of clarity here and not get too bogged down in those differences. So here, this sort of understanding of the self, or the self of the person, we have to recognize that the self of the person can't be something that is apart from all of the aggregates. But if it were the same as the aggregates, we would have a certain set of problems. And if it were sort of totally distinct from the aggregates, it wouldn't have their kinds of characteristics. There's a verse by Nagarjuna that explains this. So here, if we try to think, what is this person or this self? If we go through the sort of basis of its designation, meaning these 5 aggregates, well, can we point to something within those aggregates that is that self? Or if we were to say set them aside, is there something that we could point to that is the self? So would we be able to posit the person if, say, we didn't have the form there, or if we didn't have feelings, if we didn't have this sort of discrimination or our our consciousness, or the various imprints that have been placed upon that consciousness, our various karmic formations? So it's only in dependence upon those things that we can designate a person, that we can say this is, say, Tashi or Lobsang or whatever. But we can't, without that basis of designation, assert there to be some sort of person. So here, there is a necessary kind of contingency or dependency in that the person is not identical with those, but it's also not something that could be posited in absence of those aggregates.
oh yeah 어디 이제 담보 가지고 남주 써서 다 시치 삼로 거기다 로 해제나려 콘두레지 세베까비나다 동해레지 쇼베까비나다 뒤도 숙체요라 남주 가지고 별라고는 말이야 저 당시도 같이 전화 건도 또 저도 또 같이 저 당시요라 아니 신나 잡으러 때 다자보다 텐데 총소나 아니 그거네 배 진도가 삼사르지 나라도 신나 전부 요는 간지디 숙체로 용거다 지당 간지 여대 요래대 야그 약보다 쉬 총소는 야 가다라 쉬지 나베 삼 간지 숙체로 용거라 티드 상아데 라오아데 삼코도 담봉 아주 다들 각자 문제 쓰라 파 가야 되 문제 고야도 다우타 박송도 시계변 제반아 송도 텔레 다지 차와네 간싱어부 남게 샬라 라그말레베 모랑 신데스 다 메세 다데 카레스나 샬리아 라글 말레브체 나가랑게 요삼사 나가랑게 요삼사 소부 파샤 셈파샤 초아 파샤나 지요나 샤기도 라와시기도 라왕시기라 텔레 다지one 가싱어부 남게 샬라 라말레베 모랑 신세 다 샬라 라말레베 세데 카르스르스네 주진 샬라 라말레바 요레 디데 텔시마르 탄데델야 Shala Ramale Basibe Shende, and Chetunga Bakarusona, Tanya Shebala Shensegora. Nadu Sopurajil Ten, on the Trashires, Tisura, Dundu Res, Sobola Tene, Patagrava. Sa Tanya Giwangi. Jidelia Tanya Yoro, Tanya Giwangi. Tanya Jidengi Tanya Delia, Jimiri Tagra, over the Tonsona. Sosure Tonlena Timid or this Trashidor, this Tunduridor, the Kambaridor, the Palaridor, the Taridor, Spatagdor, or the Tanya Giwangisha. Sobuja Ton de Verdico Trashimaroa, in a Sobuton, the Sobulatane, or the Trashidor, Spatagdor, or Tidico Tanya Giwangi Pasha. Tanya Giwangi Shagba Maimba, and the Yabachina, turned by Yabasagora. Shala Ramalebe Ngorang, she said, Shan Tanya Dogbala Ramaleba, Tanya Dogbe Wangishago Yora, and the Trashire Shasana Soboton or the Trashire Shasana. Don't let it on all people to do the Shasatagdoa. Or Tiwangi to do, don't do Tundu de Yomarwa, Sobo Tundu de Yomarwa, in a teleton about Tundu Spatagdoa, or Tiwangi Pashani, and it Tundu Resia. Kane keji shek, tundu keji shek, gocho jochi, lagwa yugdona, tundu lagwa yugdusia. Pumbu chawa cheba to daga chawa cheba shagura. Pumbu de da marete. Tagana system bitsoa de dures in yonsona, or dako kibudo, tako tobudusia, shagdua. Tezu rere pumbungam rere ne ta reo martina, konzu lega chede, and it tade, jogudo, desha. Tako kibudu koto buduse nagiduse tatasha se kanga tanya shagudwa se tanya je wangi shagba maimba ene tanya be loyo wangi shagba maimba tanya be lo dakshi chile tene kona mainge chasha chile tene din diri espa tagi ora te wangi shagne te taga chasha jure mando tako te sese de kabando sena ton tambaji yona tatsene niya yokore Sobudi Mare, Sem de Mare, Soa Mare, Dushi Mare, Dima, Tan Diresha, Rutu Sachi Ragura. Yana Pumbungana de Ragure, Yana Pumbule Shanji Yogoreta. This was a round at the Yona. Yana Pumbunga the Chicks and Yogore, Yana Pumbunga the Tadesh and Yogore, or Titambu Yeshaura. We teach you on Madam. Yeah.
So here, then, when we are first beginning this kind of meditation, we need to begin by identifying this kind of object of negation. And this is really, we do this by first looking at this kind of way that a self, an I, a person appears to us, to our innate mind. Particularly, this comes on strongly when we are, say, angry with somebody or when we are experiencing a great deal of suffering. We see that some people, they will go out to, say, a cemetery and meditate there in the middle of the night, because that kind of sense of fear actually can give rise to a strong sort of grasping at an I, this innate sort of sense of I, which is the object that is to be negated. And so we first need to identify this object of negation. And here, I'm not finding the exact quote, but the Chandrakirti in his commentary to Aryadeva's 400 verses identifies this sort of I or the self as it appears to our innate mind as being something that isn't dependent upon anything else. It's sort of like autonomous, non-dependent, non-contingent. Something having a nature like that is what we are identifying as the object of negation. Now here, when we talk about a person, say on seeing a particular form, we can say, oh, that's Tashi. Or when we see someone's face, like, oh, that's Tundrup. But that face or that form is not Tashi. That face is not Tundrup. But rather, we can, on that basis, by convention, designate that as Tundrup. So there's nothing there that is established by its own side, from its own side or by its own power, but rather these things exist through the force of designation, through the force of convention, and that in that way they're actually sort of tenable. So it's a lot. It's coherent for us to say when we see a particular person, like, oh, that's Tashi, even though when we are to sort of investigate and analyze, we can see that that form isn't Tashi. But when we say, talk about Tashi is sitting there, Tashi is doing this, Tashi is doing that, we're able to speak in a coherent way about the various actions that he's doing. And all of these things exist by the force of convention, exist by the force of designation. And so too, when it comes to this sort of designations on the basis of the mental consciousness, like, oh, this person is happy, or oh, this person is not happy, we're able to do that on the basis of observing their mental sort of state, or the external kind of signs from their mental state, and make that kind of designation that is conventionally coherent, is conventionally valid. But when we actually search for such a self as it really appears to our innate mind, some kind of self that is autonomous, that's not contingent or dependent upon anything else, that isn't dependent on our designating it in this way, we can't find anything that we can point to. If such a self did exist, it would have to exist either within those aggregates. We would have to find something that we can point to within the 5 aggregates, or it would have to exist as apart from those aggregates. So this is the kind of way in which we proceed with this logical reasoning, that first we identify this thing that is to be negated, and then investigate, well, if it does exist as it appears to us, then it must exist as either one within those aggregates, or somehow separate and apart from those aggregates.
Oh yeah, that on that go. Taderwa. Tanyeji wangi shagba maiba. Ani rawa chudu yana ani tandambar yoba sidwa. Tanyeji wangi shagba maiba. Tanyeji wangi shasidu kora maingi chashe chilitene pa taane te tsamle shako yaredwa. Ta tanyeji wangi shagba tsam maiba kora ngone chu yebena rawadu yobarwa. Tanye kari lamnala malamala shidajem kora ngone chu yogurwa. Tanyeji wangi shagba maiba ani yu kora ngone chu yebena tandambar yoba sigwara. Tembar yoba tandambar yoba sigwara. Oh, tene tandambar yoba tembar yoba sigwara. Tede yebena ta ko zene raya yogore ko. Ta kagres rawantu tubachi yona tene ta seba che seba chogora. Ta sene cheba chene tene che raya chogora. Ta kadres pige yede sogudan semni duwa. Ne chora duwa. Dushi duwa pumbunga yora. Pumbunga na dudura du sosisida. Pumbunga budi rawe ta de besora. Ayana pumbunga budi rawe ta ne ta da pumbuni chiktur chikresora ta chikberesora. Yana pumbunga le loso rawe ta dugesora. Pumbunga de pasha sempasha swapasha rawe ta loga chizuzu se chiwa de besora ta de suda. Pumbunga da pumbunga na ne pumbunga de su ta su son dushi tinga de tarebe ya tinga bu karuna tarebe ya ti member ya tele tadedo rawe tayo resti chegora tanyeji wangi shagba maimba kurangone su ta chi yoyena rawe su ji yora rangsu to basere kurang su yotumgi shigora shenda roba ko mare tina ne ta de pumbunga ne chalad masu ngamado yo mara ngabuti tarebe ya na ngabuti ne chik tarebe pumbutai na shigora ana tingabu kaya mainge ya ngabuti ngasha tapalana ngobo sebuna she chala medra ngana she cheko di che antiki de tarab se dusyo de besora ngo thade shene o te chik da thade karu to yogro chidan kongobu karina tini yana chik rebese yana kaga rebese chik da thade ni nan dudu gora into ta de rawe ta shiyo na tandamba tu ta shiyo na pumbunga de rebe chala de masunga bado yomara nga derbe nga bunane sogo darbe na semde darbe na choarbe yana nga ga darbe ati maige loso tayorbe ngobu sebnashi ta palanashi kagache pumbungale ko loso tadedu yorbe oti ni dile ngeba de samu tangura rawe tachi yona pumbunga buti nane rawe tarbe te mai loso rawe tachi duwe samgura ta bole tislamna ya.
So, something which is not dependent on designation by convention, something that is existent from its own side, sort of set up by itself, which isn't dependent upon any of our designation, isn't dependent upon thought or anything like that. That would be something that is ultimately existent. That true existence is something being not dependent even upon our designating with various terms, but exists from its own side. And if such a thing were to exist, if there were to be such ultimate or true existence, then it would have to be findable. It has to be something that we can actually point to. And so here, if we have this, as it appears to our innate mind, this sense of there being some kind of a self that is autonomous, that has this kind of sort of ability and power from its own side, then we need to investigate, well, is it the case that this self is the five aggregates, is somehow within those five aggregates, or is it something that is separate and apart from those five aggregates? So here, if the five aggregates were the self, then it would have to be sort of one single entity. So here, again, we need to first recognize that anything that exists can only exist as being sort of one entity or different entities. So here, when we search out and try to see, well, does such a self exist within the aggregates? If we look within our various aggregates of form and feeling and consciousness, sort of recognition and karmic formations, is there something within those that we can actually point to as existing as the self, existing from its own side? Or is it the case that we could say, well, the self is something sort of separate from the aggregates? It's something that is not dependent upon any kind of conventional designation, but exists rather from its own side, as separate, as different from the aggregates. If that were the case, then the self and the aggregates would have to be two different kinds of entities, like blue and yellow, or like a horse and a cow, where there's no kind of relationship. So here, when we are investigating to see if such a self exists, either as one with the aggregates or as separate from the aggregates, this sort of autonomous, ultimately existent I, we have only these two real options. Is it one? Is it the one entity or of one nature with inherently one nature with those five aggregates, or is it something which is separate from, apart from those aggregates entirely? If there were to be such a truly or ultimately existent self, we would have to be able to sort of identify it or designate it as such.
Oh yeah. Mo dire. Tati ko sanje chomden de sheche gen to kapsu songutoa. Deyan jigden ge tanye ge wange yenge ta dambane mai no songutoa. Oti ngazun dol sanje sonse de kongto gora. Deyan jigden ge tanye ge wange is. Koran chashe rabchilia ani tene tele mingri re tagyora. Dit tashire ta dit kangbar ta and dit ani choksere ta se. Di medo re ta se tagdoa. Jigden ge chashe rabchile tene charnen tele tene pa ming tagra. Chashe rabchi chare tele dakshi sigwa dakshi. Daksa ki shichi korwa, tonye chikora, tangbo tonye chikora. Odile dakshi sigra. Nangba tongba liya medo re chijiri taya yo marwa. Palang rabchi ne palang gode tongsun odi palang re shasi tagri to. Deyan jigden ge tanye ge wangi shakba ingis. Tanye ge wangi koran dakshi chi char de chane o tel patong de palang re to ase ore. Tagi wara. 대왕의 샤는 코 발라 인다 일로디 티레마도 제마이 게시제 코랑 뭐냐가 발라이시 로가치 요 말에시 티요나다 더글려나시 풍부가데 다이나 소라 게데 풍부 다이나 게단 직버션도 줄 풍부 다이나 게데 풍부 다는 제 마외 다데 다자 마부 주스 알리 타부 텔람나 야마다 풍부 다이나 풍부가 요라 풍부가 요바나시 다가 요바렌도라 게데 풍부 다나 티시데 마외 다데 다자 마부 주스 다마 못하더라 다레레레 제시거래 다 소보디 다르베스 라운데 다시요나 소보디 다이네 다 강디네 제 소부 차시 딱요라 소부 차시야 디다 마르 테네 디다 마르 디다 나글로 심바지 디다 마르 네 디미 디다 마르 소부날 다행게 제메도 다나 서로 대화 양기도 티 다르베 and sometimes they kept just in the Tunga Yangdo, Tunga di Tar Besne, Temarwa. Migi Sheba, she suit on the soil or the soil, Deva Yore, Tunga Yore, Tanyum Yore, soil Damada Yora. It is a Tare di Medwa. And Dushi, Samlo or Ditirisha, Dikaburi, Dingoburis, Dushi Bachidua, Goboteda Timuzimbashi, Samarizimbash or Dikambarida, Dingoburida, Tiseburidas, Dushi Dua. Tini tamarwa. So when you say number 7, big number 7, 9 number 7, number 7, teso tamarwa. In Duji Pumbuse, Duji Pumbuse led and Yomuni de Mansha Yongore. Tive Sola Semper Chebele, Migive Sola Semper Chebele, Longaten Sola Semper Chebele, Soche goes, Kumako goes, and college, Contutango, something lesser yorno. Semper de lesser door. This December to Tarve, Temara. And it in a condo tanga jet and Sanyu to Nisha Trado dan Jansim that Tezuri Netare Temara. Then Duji Pumbunale Damadua. Tunda Pumbunala Rave Tachiana, Serave Tachiana, Pumbunaliana, Naga Diana, Tamambuchadure. Pumbunga Yabanashi, Pumbunga Diana, Tamambuchadura. Oh, tene dachi modo meba na shi pumbunga de dada chik chan pumbunga de chik chan do gora ke de pumbu dana de de mawe ta de ta ya ma bo jo se do ke de pumbu da yi na la ti chi lam na ya oh de
So here, then, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, the Buddha has stated that the conventional, the worldly, is that which is dependent on designation. So here, this is like one can point to when you have a particular sort of basis of designation, when something appears to mind, one can then point and say, oh, this is Tashi, or this is a person, this is a table, whatever it may be. And so there is, on the basis of the arising of a particular basis of designation, we designate things, and those conventional sort of designations actually exist. The worldly is coherent within that kind of framework. It's not as though these things are utterly non-existent, sort of like a sky flower, but rather there is some basis of designation, and on that basis we designate various phenomena. Like so, seeing the particular form, we say, oh, that's an ox. It's not as though we're able to assert or posit an ox in the absence of that kind of basis of designation. So in this way, all of the kinds of phenomena that exist do so in that sort of way, in that designated dependent way, as opposed to the way that our self appears to us as though it had some kind of autonomous existence from its own side without being contingent or dependent upon anything else. And so here again, if there is such a self, then it has to either exist as one with the aggregates or as separate from, apart from the aggregates. So here, the first sort of issue can be summarized in, if the aggregates were the self, then since there are many aggregates, the self would also be many. So if we are going to assert that the self is the aggregates, then we run into this issue. Well, which of these 5 aggregates is the self? Is the form the self, or is there some part of our form in particular that is the self? Is there something that we can point to within like our internal organs or our eyes or something and say, oh, that is the self? Well, there's nothing within that form aggregate that we can actually point to and say, well, that is the self. And the form aggregate itself is too made up of parts. And so too, when it comes to our feelings, is the aggregate of feelings the self? It can't be that case, because that's also, again, something that is changing. We have various sort of happy feelings and dependence upon things that we find pleasurable. And we have occasions where we say suffer, and those suffering feelings, would that suffering feeling be the self, or would those happy feelings be the self? The neutral feelings, are there then going to be multiple selves to go with those multiple feelings? Or is it the case that our sort of recognition, our cognition of things, discriminating them, saying this is blue and this is yellow, this is a horse, this is an ox? Is it that sort of faculty that is our self? Can we point to that and say that that is the self? Or is it our aggregate of consciousness, our various, again, we have within consciousness various consciousnesses, our sort of visual consciousness and auditory consciousness and mental consciousness and so forth. So can we point to one of those as being this self, this I? Or could we look within our karmic formations, kind of the various karmas that we have accumulated in the past, or that sort of mind of intention that actually is what creates karma? Or could we point to our various afflicted minds and say, well, oh, that is the self there. So if it were the case that we could point to something within the aggregates that were the self, or if the self were the aggregate, then we would run into this problem that either the selves would be multiple, as there are as many parts as there are within those aggregates, and we can see there's not just the 5 aggregates, but they break down into parts as well. Or we would have the issue that the aggregates would collapse into one thing. It would have to be a singular thing in order to match the sort of singular self that we assert. So this is the sort of first issue there.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, teacher. Janita, Tashaina soda, get a pumbutaina, get and jibachan to the order till of Gujura. Get a pumbutaina, get and jibachan to Jursigua. That Chiriba the Silpalavina, Chiribalia, Pumbungabute, Midabares, Corazzo Kellinguara. Tade Takbare, Chash Kichegumare, Chashandal Togumare, Cora, Rawan to Trubares, Lagurdo, Chamere, Chamichi Burisor. Get the Pumbutaina, get and Jibachan to use Pumbuta Daresona, Rawa Dazuna, Pumbuna, the Chi and Goda, Pumbunga, the Midabare de Toa, Duration get de Toa, Chatumayan get Yaredua, Pumburu, Soboris, Chamamudua. Chada, Duda, Shada, Rubada, Chashamamuyora, Dana Assembly, Chamabu, Simula, Chamabu, Gachada. Oh, Tini, get the Pumbu Diana, get as you was introduced. Chiribali, Cantane, Pumbutini, Diana, Pumbuti, Kinji, and get it, Kiran Tata, Takbayan Sigua, Pumbuti Chaduma, Shadua, Kiran Tati, Chamimba, Tindimudoa Sigura. Get the Pumbu Diana, get as you was introduced. Ta Ralula, Ta Nashishore, Ta Rawan to Truban Dunga, Ta Number Truban Dunga to Zulia, and then get the Pumbu Diana, get and Zibasan to Juruse. Pumbu Diana, Rawe Sugene, Pumbu Kiwada, Rawe Sugi, Pumbu Zibate Dugara. Or Tineko, Concert of Gina, Gawangame concert the Kura Rawa Chitu, Rawa in Zibate Soda. And it's Sendi Pumbu Sogura Chinako, Sendil Saba Tubara. Namade Yomar Sobode, Chemandu Marwa Shitasun Delia Degra. Intinita deco, get the Pumbu Diana, Kinji Chena, Code Les Rawan to Ki, Rawan to Sogum Babchaswa, Tana Seni, Ludilla Tebesola Soba Tezuchi Badito. And then Rawan to Trube Kinji Chan was where Rawan to Trube Kinji Chayina. Kyangame Dade, Lesange Dade, Rawan Chere, cause Rawan Kone Jixore. Tande Dade Kora Rawan Chere. Sobo Kidu Sadu Kevareda, Pumbuta in Erwa. Sobo Sadu Kera, Pamekudu Artene. And this on the code Dade Saba Kevara. Nimane Kundi Yomarwa. The Manata Lesange de Shendajiksa, Jebun Yongedi Shendaj in Yongudo Asura. Get the Pumbuta in a Kedan Jibachan to Jurse. Ne Tina Kashes Yorda, and demand the lotion in the matter. Pumbuta in Erwa, and Rapsin Yedin and in your lanza than your lembo children you there. No long but shit about your lembo in Bandusa. Pumbuta in a Namdungazo Tade Kyawa lemba bodora, Pumbunga lemba bodora. Pumbunga the lanza derawa. Me Pumbula, me saw me semji lanza, Legendi lemba boshora. Oh, Ti the Karsula. The Ketipumbuta and your lanza than your lemba boni children. Nyawa langje pumbunga di tare sora. Tine nyawa langje da nyawa lemba buchi re duwa. Kwenchi yungore. Kedi pumbu tayi na. Nikasira. Nyawa drapchi nyitumba na duwa. Nyawa langba chita bu nyawa lemba yimba dios. Nyawa langje pumbu di nyawa lemba bu tare duwes. Ene ta taa goya me duwa pumbu tare de duwa. Taa se lemba bu taa mebare duwa sura. Nyawalang bachita wa nyawa lembo imban yos. Ane china tal nyawalang jada lemba bu nyichik re do. Le da rwa langje le te da langba bu nyidi chikba chik chandu do. Nyawa kasire. Le da cheba bu chik tu du de se do langje langje ni. Ane tine pishin da meni bu te ane chik re do de sora. Cheba bu da le chen de de bashe. 다 풍부니라 신체나 내체 숨땡기도 저 숨르지 땡기도 다다 풍부니 지기나로 저 숨인 거라 담불 가르스나 다 풍부니라 신체나 내체 숨요래 다도 마왔던 다메라 다세 로가 샤고 마라 풍부가도 다래도 다 로숨 매바다 풍부 다임 버쳐 녀와 렘바보 매베 녀와 랑자 다래도 지라 다르도마 때문에 봤지라. 아니 다 망부 좋아서 되려 생바 풍부가 여번에시 다 대가 된도라. 대생 말하니 소부 다이네 소부 차세 강벌하고 레레레네 다이 베술 찬도르도. 다전다 다 망부 타에 타와더라. 다 로스 샤바던 다메가 된도래. 다 망부 좋도 그래. 다 망부 좋아서. Kinji Tambune, Rabjin Yutumbale, Nyawa Lemba Matobe, Tayu Mai Chebe Sesido, Nyawa Lengi Tayana, Kiki Dan, Meba Institute. Karan Dagi, Loga Shagumedua, Nyawa Lanja Korantare, the Loasera, Nyawa Lemba Matoba, Nyawa Lemba Sena Lanja Pumbudu Sigora, Tayo Mayumba and Dose, Tayu Mai Chebese. Nyawa Lengi Tayana, Kiki Dan, Yele Pumbu Diana, Karan Dad, Loga Shagumedua, that time ever Shaswa. Pumbu lemba bu taashe, pumbu lemba bu kansashe, leja ta de loga shama swa, pumbu kora de tire swa so, odi kyo sumshi dang doa. Nyele ta yene kyoji dani meba yinse. Niba dele kedi pumbu dana tishi di mawe dante taja mambu juose, ta mambu juwa yung doa. Sumba ni rabji choge bali ya, kedi pumbu ta yene kedan jikba chen do juru sete. O tishi lamne ta mangda swa. Yeah.
So here then when it gets into looking at these various positions, we begin by looking at, well, if the 5 aggregates are the self. Now, here there are sort of particular refutations that apply to those that would propound some kind of a permanent a self, some sort of outsiders that would propound a permanent autonomous kind of a self. And so here, if the self has the nature of the aggregates, then that would mean that it's necessarily impermanent. And it's also something that can't be partless, because we look at the sort of aggregates themselves, and they have various parts. So to assert some kind of permanent, partless, autonomous self that has the nature of these aggregates, that's not something that is tenable or is viable. Because when we look at the kind of various parts of this basis of designation, so can we say that, oh, well, the self is the form, or is it something within that form? There are many various parts of our form, our sort of our skin and our bones and our blood and so forth. What is the part that one can show as being the self? So here, just step back a moment. There are sort of the faults that are pointed out with there being some kind of partless, permanent, autonomous self, a specific sort of refutation of that non-Buddhist way of thinking. But here, even just if we sort of look at the self as it appears to us as having some sort of autonomy, some sort of like being existent from its own side without having to be designated or dependent upon anything else, we can see the sort of faults that arise from that. Because is it then the case that if we aren't dependent upon a previous life, we would still say in this life be dependent upon the coming together of the sperm and an egg in order to generate that sort of human? So there can't be this self that is set up from its own side. But to just sort of back up to what are the kinds of issues that would arise if it were the case that the self were one with the aggregates, that you tried to assert that such a self were of the nature of the aggregate. The first would be that it would be pointless to propound a self. We talk about the self as being the appropriator of these appropriated aggregates. The self takes up these contaminated aggregates and appropriates them. Well, how can you speak of there being someone or thing that appropriates, takes up something, if they are the same thing? So basically, it would be pointless to propound a self if the self and the aggregates were identical. And then secondly, we would have the fault. So again, we have from Nagarjuna his root verses on wisdom, or fundamental treatise. When there is no self except for the appropriated aggregates, then the appropriated aggregates are the self. In that case, the self you propose does not exist, or that sort of self that is being propounded is not logical. And then second, if it were the case that the self were intrinsically the aggregates, we would have this fault that the selves would become many. So if the aggregates were the self, then since there are many aggregates and many pieces or parts within those aggregates, then the selves would also be many. We would have as many selves as there are parts of the aggregates. And then finally, the third sort of issue that would arise is that if the aggregates were the self, then the self would be subject to production and disintegration. It would follow the sort of production and disintegration of our various aggregates. And in that way, the self would be destroyed when these aggregates are destroyed.
당주 다디 풍부다 라와도 주베 찌이나 껴도와 풍부가 레레레 다이나 저금도와 나가 다이나 저금도와 무티엔티 버셔 다 풍부래 풍부다 찌 다디 라와 주베 찌이스나 저금도 다 라와에 다디 풍부다 나다 찌이스나 대금도 삼티 타셔라 다 라와에 다디나 풍부다 타대인스나 그런가도 쓰거라 라오에 다디 풍부다 찌긴스네 견도세 다 라오에 다디 풍부다 타대인스네 되기도 아스나 어디 등 말해서로 게디 풍부 남래신 풍부 천이 매버려 조성도 풍부 남래신 풍부가부터래 라오에 수기 현도여나 다디 배로스여나 코나 라와체 코는 자와게 먹어 코나 라와체 저로가 여나 가서 락바 예바 여만 시카가로와 게디 풍부 남래신 풍부 천이 매버려 조스티견다도 저는 풍부 소보다 다니디 류다 수기 풍부다 다니부터 배 가가 예나로 라마베 타대 예나시거라 ane sokbo ge senyi kyawa dan jigba dan la sokbo ko senyi mangbu yorwa sokbo kyawa dan nawa dan chiwa la sokbo senyi mangbu yorwa sokbo drowa dan teba dan so cheba dan majimba lemba dan ta chawa mangbu yorwa sokbo chawa phungbi senyi phungbu liya kyawa dan jigba dan neba dan drowa dan teba la sokbo chawa mangbu yorwa phungbi senyi meba yorse ane sokbo dege drosona kombajam drosona ta dro mai bachagra ta da sogo ni pe ngombo sebe na shi kagara ba ta bana na shi sora lagba yeba yoma na shi ra lagba yeba gele ga chene yamba gele ga chebe tan dro mara kuni pe rawe kagare sora tirwa te de ne phumbu ke ta sogo male ke son ta ke sora ta sogo ge son ta ge sha sora sogo debe choma son ta na sha sora ni komba jab son ta dro do sora ro ene o te na shi phumbu le chawa mangbu yo da te so ganga de chi de ta ge chawa chawa mai ban ro re ta dro ge yo ma re de ge yo ma re khala sa ge yo ma re sogo khala sa ge kha ge ne che ma to ta khala sa yo ma ra ene phumbu chen me ba re do da sogo ge chawa chawa to so ta ge chawa chawa ro ma re ka re ta da sogo ni pe rawa de tu be kha ga re lakba yin na shi re ta da bana na shi re ngobo se na shi ra o ta na shi chora yesu tong ta ti ro de jan de long jan chwa de wa yong gu de kabri chwa dong ye yong gu de kabri chwa ta yong gu de chwa de wa nyong so na chwa de wa yong de ta ge de wa nyong ma re chwa dong ye chong so ta dong ye yong gu ma re so bul dong ye chong so na so bu dong ye yong gu ma do ta dong ye yong gu ma re 소에 되니 긴질라 소본 유도 차와 가르치는데 다가 차와 쳐본 누구 말해 다나신 두시 대하고서 대세버려서 대원버려서 두시 따른지 마시라 원봉원부 세버세버 까무 니메리 니팔라리 니따레세 저주 강간 두시라 아니 네디 까가 강아 시엔소는 두시 디까렌디 시소는 다게 까신게 말해 다게 두시 깨게 말해 samlunan dushi yuna patan parun dushi ba mar dushi ba sayan dushi ba tesan dushi ba tu kanga yudi ko ha go yo mar ta de ke chawa je mi do ta ne shin number shi ba pumbule sawa da me sawa la so ba yo he do ta chu nam shi ge chawa che ba te du mare tin duji ji pumbu ke cho le samlutan so ko le ke wasa mi ge cho le sem ba chi mi ge le sa ro ene kondo sadu ta kondo se chado chi du jan lo de chado che ma do ta chado chi ge ma se de chado che ba mai ba tan do to de cha kondo nga je chado nap sin de sim le so ba de ju chawa che ba de ta chawa che ba re ma re kuni pe so ra ka ga ra o ti de ke de phumbu nam le shen phumbu chen ye me ba de yo ru se de phumbu le pe rang we ka ga da ji na 네 풍부 자와제도 강가 다가 자와제 많이 버려도 그래서라 풍부 생기 계속 깨와다 각바다 직벌서 자와제도 강가 다가 자와제 많이 버려도 그래서 군이 자와게 요 말은 뭐 세븐 내시라 라바야 내시라 따바는 내시라 바세요라 어 되지려
So then, if this self, this kind of self that appears to us to be autonomous, is somehow then apart from the self. So if we have determined that it's not tenable, it's not logical for us to say that, say, the aggregates are the self, then the other position would be that the self is somehow different, distinct from the aggregates. So if it were the case that the self were then something distinct, totally separate from the aggregates, then we would have the issue, as Nagarjuna says, if the self were other than the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the the aggregates. So if something that is totally separate, that is totally different, sort of like an ox and a horse, or a horse and a cow, or blue and yellow, these don't have the same sort of characteristics. So if that were the case, that our self were to somehow be totally distinct and separate from the aggregates, then we wouldn't be able to say coherently, like say, I was born, I am aging, I am sick, because all of those things are characteristics of the aggregates. It is characteristic of our, say, form aggregate. It has been born, it came into being, and will age, and we experience sickness and so forth. Or when our form is, say, sitting or going or eating, it wouldn't be possible for us to say, oh, I am going, I am sitting, I am eating, because those characteristics, the qualities of the aggregates, are separate, are apart from the self, that is somehow sort of autonomous and distinct. And so when we have that kind of relationship between two things, there's no way that they can share characteristics. It's like our right and left hands. Whatever our right hand is doing, our left hand isn't necessarily doing. They're just distinct, they are separate. And so when we say things like, oh, I was born, or I grow old, I will die, it wouldn't be coherent. We can't talk about that, because that self is somehow distinct, is somehow separate from the aggregates, and therefore cannot possess the kind of characteristics of the aggregate. So the things that our form aggregate is doing, like if you are eating, it would not be tenable to say, I am eating, or the self is eating, because that's just the character of the form aggregate. And the self can't sort of share those characteristics, as it's something distinct. Or the feelings couldn't be the self. So sometimes we feel sort of pleasurable sensations, or sometimes unpleasant sensations, and so forth. But those would not be the self. We couldn't say like, oh, I'm happy or I'm upset, because again, the self doesn't possess those characteristics. It doesn't share the kind of identifying qualities of those aggregates. Or so too, when it comes to our discrimination or distinction, the ability to recognize and identify things as distinct. If we have that kind of mental factor of identifying things that leads us to have comprehension, it still wouldn't then be possible to say, oh, I understand this, because it's not actually the characteristic of the self. So even though we may have learned our letters and so forth, be able to distinguish, oh, this is an A, B, C, and whatever it may be, the self would not actually be literate, because that literacy, that ability to read and know letters, is a characteristic of the aggregates. It's something that is a quality of the aggregates. And we have asserted that the self is something separate, something different from the aggregates, like blue and yellow, like a cow and a horse, like our right hand and our left hand. So too, when it comes to our various other mental states, our mental factors of being angry or attached or jealous, or having doubt, all of these things, we couldn't say, oh, the self, like I am angry, I am attached, because that's totally separate from those sorts of mental factors and so forth. So if there is a self that exists in this kind of autonomous way, it has to, and we are asserting that it is, we've already established it can't be the same as the aggregates, and so then try to assert that it is something distinct or separate from the aggregates, we run into all of these problems, because as Nagarjuna has told us, that something that is other than the aggregates cannot possess its characteristics, could not be have the nature of those aggregates.
Oh yeah. Ta de kya dan jibala soba phumbu ngabo chawa chawa de ta chawa chawa mijuna ta la kya dan jibala soba chawa khaya mebra ndu do ni ta de takba de ndu re chera ani kare sna ko chawa khaya cheyo mardo ani ta se tanda ke yo mare juba chawa khala ju thuk mare khala do thuk mardo titu nyoya yo marwa ta ge tunge nyungure tunge de chewe chedu tarwa topgure sara dezu de mebe chandu do ta de du nyoy ke ho maro ani ta te ha tuge ta tunge se tandu beba chig marto o ti indi pumbule de shendo ta yo mare se no ani ta de cha kaya mena ani 다들 저와가 좀 딱바래도 그래. 딱바이나 아니 가서 치료받아내 센터도 죽배 풍불에 대해서 다 럽지 니수자 되면을 송도 다네 냐와를 렘발에 샤도 태바니 마인세 얘네 풍불에 뭐 타대도 라고 쓰지요 말했어. 다네 냐와를 렘발에 샤도 태바니 마에 냐와레니 아예나 데데레 다네 냐와를 렘발에 샤도 태바니 마인세 럽지 좀 다네 냐와를 렘발에 샤도 태바니 마에 걔데 셴나 렘에 봐 송유레나 송도면서 어디 야고라 다니 냐와 렘발에 셴도 태그 말했으 년에지 풍불에 다 라오에 타데도 여바 태그 말이셔라 셴도 태그 말이셔라 다니 냐와 렘발 셴트면 걔데 셴나 렘에 봐 송유레나 송도면서도 걔데 다데 냐와 렘베 풍불에 라오에 셴이나 얘네 다 셴도 여바이나 근데 아주 다 뭐송도사 야나 소보럽시다 야나 소소 셈다 소화다 풍부가고 가run지 잘 얘네 다 차고도 와. 다 풍부 송화라 뜨네 다 송고야 메도아서래. 다 코란 배 풍부래 로스네 로스 카두 코라 디 다레스 람데 드라. 풍부 통네 디 다레스 송에 메로와. 디 소보데 마데 따따 디르세 로가지 문지치야 요르와 외고르와 티 메도아서라. 게디 풍부 남레세 풍부 생이 매번 요르세. 뭐라 걔도 풍부 남레세 풍부 생이 매번 요르세. 디자 되네. 딩딩메도다. 죽발래잖아. 디지 풍불래셔 다음에 디지 버시. 오만 죽발값서 디지 풍불래셔 다음에 풍부마도 딘지 마둡시서도. 말아서 다 손두사 안에 칠로 미치네 칠로 속보다시 때내네 다 차고라. 카둘 태가 다 고란 데르서 문지 지야면도 야네 깨지레셔서 그 깨질 때는 어디를 샤섬 아니 바다고도 와 아니 소소 딱 봐야네 소소 기부러지 뭐아 다들은 기부 맞아서 소할 때는 바다다고도 와 야부서 어쩌지 배 야부서 소섬 소할 때는 다다고도 와 야네 두실 때는 삼루탄달 때는 다다 그래 야네 소할 때는 다다 그래 야나 넘버 쉐발 때는 셈기 마기다 셈기지 야부통아도 두부통아 들 때는 드링에 티 야부통소세 드링에 야부신 소세 드링 야부신 마소세다 근데 다니셔구라 저도 강가 매우 차려도 가셔서 this 걔도 풍부남을 뭐지 다 되시나 엄마 주바 갑소 때 this one 가르쳐 보시면 풍부마도 든지 마도 제소하래 어제도 다데 풍부다 배랑에 타데도 연하와 타데도 연하 근데 내시 마부도 와 저데 딩이 어디래 다데 라에 다데 연하 딱도 쟤네 녀 요거래 데레 신주고 쫓아줘 요거래 하베베세제티 마드라시 첸달라 뜨진 델네 샤야 요 말에 데레스 되는 배 오늘 전에 문제 로스 요거라 티 문제 제야 요거래 티 요마르 숨거다 단디메도 디바체 랑게 ngo드베 타데도 요나 다다 풍부니 다랑게 ngo드베 찍도야메 랑게 ngo드베 타데도 메바틀레 네바니니도 장고레 숨거도 딜레 네셰게 라we 타디요나 야나 풍부가다 찍은 거래 야나 타데 연구래 찍이나 견데도 타데이나 견데도 something 야보지 하마고나 근데 다음에 왜 동반예세 람나자 야보지 하고요 말을 쓴 것도 담보 찍다 타데이니데 나도 남주 찍두래기 땡지서라 라와도 왜 찍도 하면 타데도 매베 쳤어 이제네 타가세로 타준세로 샤야요로 디실라면 두주 좋아해서라 야
So here again, as it says, if the self were other than the aggregates, it would not have the characteristics of the aggregates. So this is what Nagarjuna has stated, that if it weren't the case, if it were the case that we have some kind of self that is somehow apart from, separate from the aggregates, then we couldn't talk about the self being able to act or being able to engage or being able to have any sort of experiences, because that is done by the aggregates. Those are all included within the aggregates. And if we are asserting that there is some sort of self that is apart from, separate from, inherently different from the aggregates, then it wouldn't have any kind of connection with them. So it wouldn't make sense to say make an effort to eliminate our suffering or trying to get our happiness, because there's no connection, again, between those experiences and actions and so forth and the self. So here we would potentially have the issue that the self, if it is not, if it were essentially different from the aggregates, it would not have the aggregates characteristics of arising, remaining, and disintegrating. And so if the aggregates, if it is asserted that the self is something entirely separate from the aggregates that doesn't have its kind of characteristics, then one would have to say that there's a sort of like a permanent self that is somehow doesn't have those characteristics of abiding and disintegrating as do our aggregates. And that, again, is not tenable in any way. And so here too, when it comes then to the self being totally separate or apart from the aggregates, farther down, Nagarjuna has said that it is not correct for the self to be other than the appropriated aggregates. If it were other, it could be apprehended without the appropriated aggregates, yet it is not. So here, if it were the case that there were some sort of autonomous, independent kind of self set up from its own side, it wouldn't be dependent in any way upon the aggregates. And so we wouldn't sort of need the aggregates as a basis for identifying the self. But when it comes to when we actually have a sense of self, it is always in relation to the aggregates. Like say when we see someone's form, we then think, oh, that's Tashi, or we hear their voice and recognize that that's an individual, or based upon any one of those aggregates, we could designate there as being a self, but there isn't something that we could observe apart from. There's no way to have any sort of appearance of a self that is totally separate or apart from all of the aggregates. If we've set aside feeling and form and consciousness and discrimination and mental formations, we can't have any sort of appearance of the self. And so if there were such a real truly existent, inherently existent self, it would have to be something that is findable within the aggregates. It would have to be something that we could actually point to as existing in the way that it appears to us. But there isn't sort of any of there isn't any such self that we can identify when we engage in this kind of analysis. So again, this is something where there are various sorts of faults that arise if we are to assert that there is, like it appears to our innate mind. So first we're identifying that object of negation and then saying, is it possible for it to exist as inherently one with the aggregates, or different, inherently separate or apart from, different from the aggregates? And these are the various faults that would incur. And so this is something, again, where we don't just sort of, we're not just doing this to be able to list these off, but we actually really need to think about for ourselves and engage in this kind of analysis in order to have an understanding of the way in which the self can't actually exist as either sort of singular with or distinct from the aggregates. So here, this kind of extensive analysis is something that we need to engage in. And here, I think that's going to take up all of the time we have for today.
Oh, that is what it is, yeah. Oh, that's it.
So thank you all. The time is up for today. And I'm sorry I didn't get the questions in today. So I will try to do that next time.
Oh, yeah.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path and all spiritual friends who practice it have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable and their virtuous action spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Losong's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayame. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. In the snowy mountain pure land, you're the source of good and happiness. Powerful Tenzin Gyatso Chenrezi, may you stay until samsara ends.
Thank
Oh,
you,
yeah.
Geshe. Thank you, Katrina. And so glad everyone could join us. The next class is next Saturday, March 26th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. See you then.
군자 제마 제영 투체나.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's it.
Thank you all.